"It's time you sold this place and moved into assisted living, Mom," my son Mark announced over dinner, like he was suggesting a new brand of coffee. I didn't even blink. If only he knew I could buy 10 houses in cash tomorrow. Instead, I passed him the potatoes and said, "Sweetheart, finish your meal before it gets cold." Folks, follow my story until the end and comment the city you're listening from. Let's see how far the truth travels. My name is Nora Whitfield, and for the last 6 months I've been living a lie. Not the kind you tell strangers, but the kind you carry quietly, testing the people you love most to see who they really are when they think you've got nothing left. The invitation to dinner came in the middle of a damp, gray morning. Mark's voice over the phone was flat, like he was reading from a script. "Come by Friday night. Elaine's making her seafood chowder." I almost laughed. The woman could scorch toast without trying, but I'd learned to hold my tongue. "That sounds lovely," I said. "What time?" "7. And Mom." A pause. I could hear the faint murmur of Elaine in the background, clipped and sharp. "Maybe dress up a bit this time. You know how Elaine likes things to look presentable." Presentable. I stared at my reflection in the hallway mirror, salt and pepper hair pulled back, hands worn from years of sewing for strangers and cooking for family. Presentable to who, exactly? Ken, the harbor always smelled of salt and engine oil in the early hours. I used to love that mix. It meant work, purpose, and the start of another day with Henry. Back then, the shop was small. Just 2 sewing machines and a counter stacked with spools of thread in every shade you could imagine. The faint hiss of the iron, the dry snap of fabric under sharp scissors, those were our background music. Henry would hum under his breath while cutting cloth, and I'd watch the morning light spill across his shoulders. It felt like our life was stitched together as neatly as the seams we made. Strong, even, built to last. When Mark and his brother were little, they'd sit under the counter, playing with fabric scraps, pretending they were pirates on some faraway sea. We never made much, but we made enough. Enough to keep the boys in school clothes that fit, enough to save for a modest vacation once a year. Usually up the coast in a rented cabin. Those trips were my favorite. The boys would run wild on the rocky beach, while Henry and I sat with mugs of coffee, breathing in the briny air and dreaming about the future. But the future doesn't always arrive the way you plan. Henry's heart gave out one afternoon in the shop. I was hemming a curtain, head down, when the scissors clattered to the floor. By the time I reached him, it was already too late. The months after were a blur of bills, sympathy cards, and the empty sound of the shop without his voice. I kept it going as long as I could. Couldn't bear to let go. But eventually, the customers thinned, and the numbers in the ledger told the truth. It was time to close. I sold the machines. One to a young woman starting her own alterations business, the other to a man who promised he'd keep it working for decades. The day the shop sign came down, I walked the length of Main Street feeling like I'd lost him all over again. "Mark helped me move the last boxes into the house," he said. "Better this way, Mom. You can rest now." Rest. As if my hands didn't still ache to work, as if my mind didn't still need something to build. It was around then that Lily started coming by more often. She was 16 then, all elbows and quick smiles, always bringing some small thing. A loaf of bread she'd baked in school, a sketch she'd drawn of the harbor. She never asked for anything in return. We'd sit in the kitchen, the kettle hissing softly, and she'd tell me about her classes, her friends, her plans to study marine biology. Those visits became the bright points in long, gray weeks. I didn't tell her about the bills piling up, or the repairs the house needed, or the way Mark and Elaine had started circling the conversation toward options. For my future. Lily's laughter was like a patch over a fraying seam. It didn't fix everything, but it kept me from unraveling completely. After Henry was gone, the house became too quiet. The ticking clock in the hallway seemed louder, the gulls outside sharper in their cries. I kept his boots by the back door for months, as if he might walk in from the yard and leave them there again. The jacket he wore to the shop still hung in the closet, smelling faintly of cedar and the sea. Mark visited less often after the shop closed. At first, he blamed work. Later, it was, "The kids are busy," or "Elaine's parents need help." I tried not to take it personally, but there was a shift, a coolness in his voice, a glance that lingered on the peeling paint near the window or the sag in the porch steps. Elaine's visits were different. She'd arrive with a smile stretched tight, offering to bring me brochures for retirement communities with ocean views. I would nod politely, pour her tea, and watch her eyes skim over the shelves where Henry's model ship still sat gathering dust. One autumn afternoon, she ran her fingers over the arm of the sofa. "Time for an update, don't you think?" she said. I looked at the cushions, faded but firm, and remembered the day Henry carried them up the steps, laughing when they barely fit through the door. "It served us well," I replied. Money became a topic they circled like gulls over a fishing boat, never landing outright but always there. A question about the heating bill, a comment about property taxes. Mark once mentioned, almost casually, that selling the house could free you from the burden and give them peace of mind. I knew what they sawed, an aging widow in a weathered home on a valuable strip of land. What they didn't see, or didn't care to, was the life inside these walls. The scent of Henry's aftershave still lingering in the bedroom, the worn spots on the kitchen floor where we danced on New Year's Eve. The photograph of our boys, gap-toothed and sunburned, framed on the mantel. Through it all, Lily kept coming. She never asked about money or hinted at moving me anywhere. Instead, she'd lean on the counter while I made tea, telling me about the harbor seal she'd spotted or the paper she was writing. Sometimes she'd bring fresh mussels, still smelling of the tide, and we'd cook them together, steam fogging the kitchen windows. It was during one of those evenings, as the kettle began to whistle, that I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. Headlights swept across the front porch. I saw Mark's car through the curtain, and the way my stomach tightened told me this visit wasn't going to be like the others. The doorbell rang before I could even take the kettle off the stove. Steam hissed into the kitchen air, curling around the edges of the window as Lily set down the bowl of mussels we'd just cleaned. "I'll get it," I told her, drying my hands on a towel. My slippers made soft thuds on the worn hallway rug. Through the frosted glass of the front door, I could see Mark's silhouette, shoulders squared, head angled down like he was already bracing for a fight. I opened the door. The smell of cold sea air swept in, carrying a faint trace of gasoline from his car. Elaine stood beside him, clutching her purse like she was guarding something precious. "Mom," Mark said, his tone clipped. "We need to talk." No greeting, no smile. I stepped aside, letting them in. The floorboards groaned under their weight, a sound I knew too well. It came from the same spot Henry had once promised to fix next weekend. In the kitchen, Lily straightened, offering a polite hello. Elaine returned it with a smile so brief it barely touched her lips. "We won't stay long," she said. "This is important." I gestured toward the table. "Sit then." Mark didn't. He stayed standing, hands shoved into his coat pockets. "We've been looking at your finances, Mom. You can't keep this place up on your own. It's not safe, and it's not practical." The word landed like a pebble dropped into deep water, small, but its ripples spread fast. Elaine's voice softened, but her eyes stayed sharp. "You've had a good run here, Nora. But maybe it's time to think about what's best for everyone." I pulled out a chair for myself, sat slowly. The steam from the kettle still lingered, mingling with the briny scent of mussels. "Best for everyone?" I asked. "Or best for you?" Mark shifted his weight, looking toward the window. "This house needs repairs. The taxes aren't getting any lower. We can sell it, invest the money, and make sure you're taken care of." The way he said, "taken care of," made my stomach tighten. Henry used to use those words too, but back then, they were a promise, not a transaction. Lily glanced between us, her brow furrowed. She didn't speak, but I could feel her siding with me, silent and steady. I folded my hands on the table. The light caught the silver of my wedding band, worn thin from decades of use. "I appreciate your concern," I said. "But I'm managing." Elaine's smile returned brittle. "For now. But winter's coming and—" "Enough." The word came out sharper than I'd intended, and even Lily looked startled. "We're not having this conversation tonight." A mark exhaled through his nose, a sound of frustration. "We'll talk again soon," he said, already turning toward the door. I followed them to the porch. The wind had picked up, rattling the porch rail. As their car pulled away, taillights fading into the dark, I knew this was only the beginning, and that their patience would run out long before mine did. The next morning, the wind off the harbor carried the tang of salt and wet wood through the kitchen window. I wrapped my hands around a mug of coffee, letting the heat seep into my fingers. Outside, gulls wheeled against a pale sky, their cries sharp and insistent. I thought about Mark's face the night before, how his jaw tightened when I refused, how Elaine's eyes flicked over every corner of the kitchen like she was assessing its value. It wasn't the first time I'd seen that look. Last Christmas, they'd arrived late to dinner. I'd set the table with Henry's old silver, polished until it shone, and laid out the cranberry, glazed ham I'd spent the day preparing. Elaine had taken one bite, set her fork down, and said, "You should really let us host next year. It's too much for you." Mark had nodded, adding, "Yeah, Mom. You're not as quick as you used to be." It was dressed up as concern, but the words landed like stones. I'd smiled through the rest of the evening, pouring wine, laughing in the right places. Inside, though, something small and sturdy had begun to crack. Another memory surfaced. The spring Mark came over to help, with yard work. I'd been trimming the hydrangeas when he strolled up, hands in pockets, surveying the property like a foreman. "You should hire someone for this, Mom. Or better yet, just sell. Less hassle for everyone." He'd chuckled, but it wasn't a joke. I sipped my coffee, its bitterness matching the taste of those moments. Lily's voice floated from the living room, humming along to some tune on the radio. She was here again, uninvited but always welcome, sorting through the mussels we hadn't cooked the night before. The scent of the sea still clung to them, mingling with the warm, rich smell of coffee. I watched her through the doorway. She moved easily in my kitchen, the same way I once did in Henry's shop. It struck me how few people entered this house without an agenda. Lily came to be with me, not for what I had, but for who I was. The floor creaked as I stepped into the living room. "You're up early?" I said. She grinned. "Couldn't sleep?" "Thought we'd make chowder for lunch." Her words were simple, but they warmed something in me. I nodded, setting my mug down. "Good idea." While she worked, I pulled a quilt from the back of the couch and wrapped it around my shoulders. The fabric was worn thin in places, soft from years of use. Henry's mother had made it for us as a wedding gift. I ran my fingers over the stitches, each one small and tight, holding together against time and wear. I realized then that I was holding my life together the same way, small, deliberate acts, each one a refusal to unravel. No matter how much pressure came from the outside. Lily looked up from the pot. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I said, and for the moment it was true. But I knew the next knock on my door from Mark or Elaine wouldn't be for a visit. It would be for the house, the land, the things they thought they could claim. And I'd be ready for them. 3 days later, Mark showed up unannounced. The knock was quick, impatient. I opened the door to find him holding a leather folder, its edges worn smooth, as if he'd been carrying it around for a while. Elaine wasn't with him this time. "Morning, Mom," he said, stepping inside without waiting for me to invite him. The smell of cold air and gasoline trailed in with him. "Got something we need to go over." In the kitchen, he laid the folder on the table and flipped it open. Papers slid across the wood. Contracts printouts official letterhead. My stomach tightened. "What's all this?" I asked, my voice flat. He pulled a pen from his pocket, clicking it twice. "It's just a preliminary agreement. If we list the house now, we can get top dollar before winter. This realtor I know says waterfront properties are moving fast." I looked down at the pages. The type was dense, small. My name appeared at the top in bold. "And you've already filled this out?" I said. "Just the basics," he replied. "Makes it easier for you. All you need to do is sign here." He tapped the bottom right corner with the pen. A draft from the window stirred the edges of the papers. They smelled faintly of ink and fresh toner, a sharp scent that reminded me of the bank office where Henry and I had once signed the mortgage. Back then, it had felt like claiming a future. Now, it felt like surrender. "I'm not signing anything today," I said. Mark's jaw worked, but he kept his voice even. "Look, Mom, I'm trying to help. Taxes, repairs, upkeep. It's too much. This way, you'll have cash in the bank. No worries. A tash in the bank?" I thought about the envelope tucked in my sewing basket, the winning ticket still crisp. If only he knew. I gathered the papers into a neat stack and pushed them back toward him. "I'll read these over," I said, "but I make my own decisions." His eyes narrowed just slightly before he smiled. A thin, practiced smile, sure, but let's at least go to the bank today, check on your accounts, make sure everything's in order. The suggestion caught me off guard.
"Why? Because,"
he said, "if you do decide to sell, we'll need to know where the funds will go. Better to be prepared." Against my better judgment, I agreed. At the bank, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The air smelled faintly of floor polish, and the paper cups stacked beside the coffee machine in the corner. The carpet muffled our steps as we approached the counter. A young teller with bright red glasses greeted us. "How can I help you?" "Just checking on my mother's accounts," Mark said before I could speak. "Make sure there aren't any issues?" I shot him a look but handed over my ID. The teller tapped at her keyboard, the soft clack of keys filling the pause. Her brows lifted slightly. "There have been a couple of withdrawals this month larger than usual. Do you want me to print the statements?" "Less," I said quickly. Mark shifted beside me. "I've been helping Mom with some bills," he offered too casually. The teller slid the warm printouts across the counter. I scanned the columns, my eyes catching on one figure in particular, an amount I hadn't touched, gone without my knowledge. I folded the papers and slipped them into my bag. "Thank you," I told the teller, my voice steady. But inside, the tide had shifted. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about control. We left the bank in a brittle silence. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of seaweed and diesel from the harbor. Mark walked a few steps ahead, his shoulders tight beneath his jacket. I followed, clutching my bag, feeling the weight of the statements inside. He didn't mention the withdrawals. Neither did I. On the surface, we were just a mother and son walking to the car. Underneath, a fault line had opened. Back home, he dropped me off with a quick, "Think about the papers." His tires crunched over the gravel as he pulled away, the sound fading into the steady rush of waves against the shore. I set my bag on the kitchen table and drew out the printouts. The paper was still warm from the bank's printer. I ran my finger down the columns, my eyes stopping at the two largest withdrawals, amounts big enough to notice, small enough to pass as helping with bills, if no one looked too closely. The dates were recent. The pays were vague, nothing that tied back to anything I'd authorized. I pulled open the drawer where I kept my check register and receipts, the scent of old paper and dried ink rising as I shuffled through the stack. Each record was in my handwriting, careful and small. I prided myself on knowing every penny's path, but these amounts, these gaps, weren't mine. In the living room, the clock ticked steadily, the same way it had since Henry hung it on the wall after our wedding. I remembered how he'd insisted we keep track of everything, so no one can tell you where your money should go. It had seemed old-fashioned then. Now it felt like armor. I spread the papers out, side by side. Statements from the last 6 months, check stubs, utility bills. My fingertips picked up the faint grit of dust from the edges. It was all there in black and white, small inconsistencies building into something I couldn't ignore. From the window, I saw Lily walking up the path, her hair loose, a paper bag tucked under one arm. She knocked lightly before letting herself in. "Brought you some rolls from the bakery," she said, setting the bag on the counter. "Smelled them baking this morning and thought of you." I managed a smile. "Thank you, dear." She noticed the papers on the table. "What's all this?" "Just going over some things," I replied, folding the bank statements into a manila envelope, making sure everything's in order. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment as if she sensed more. But she didn't press. Instead, she moved to the kettle, filling it with water. The familiar hiss filled the air, mingling with the warm smell of fresh bread from the bag. I sat back watching her. If there was anyone I could trust, it was Lily. But for now, this was mine to carry. Quietly. When she left later, I returned to the table, sliding the envelope into the bottom drawer beneath the phone book. My hand rested there for a long moment. Outside, the tide was coming in, slow and steady. I thought of the ocean wearing down rock, patient, relentless. Whatever Mark was doing, he'd been careful. But so could I, and when the time came, I would be ready to show him exactly how much I'd been paying attention. The first real cold snap of the season came overnight. By morning, a thin frost silvered the porch rail, and the air from the harbor carried a sharper bite. I wrapped a scarf around my neck before stepping outside to collect the mail. The wind tugged at the edges of my coat, carrying the distant clang of a Bowie bell. The mailbox held only 2 envelopes, one from the electric company, the other a glossy flyer for a retirement community with ocean views. I didn't need to check the return address to guess where that came from. Elaine had left one just like it on my kitchen counter last month, as if planting seeds. Inside, I set the mail on the table and made a pot of tea. The kettle's whistle seemed louder in the stillness. These days, the house felt even quieter. Calls from Mark had dwindled to brief check-ins, usually ending with a reminder to think about the papers or a question about my health. Invitations to family dinners, once regular, had stopped entirely. The first time I noticed, I told myself it was the season, People were busy, days were shorter. But the second, third, fourth time, it became clear they were pulling away. Not all at once, but with the slow precision of someone untying knots they no longer wanted to keep. Lily was the exception. Every Wednesday, like clockwork, she came through the back door with a smile and something in her hands. A bag of apples, a jar of chowder, a book she thought I might like. Her presence filled the house in a way the wind or the gulls or even the old clock couldn't. One afternoon, as we peeled potatoes at the sink, she said, "You've been quiet lately?" "Just thinking," I told her. "About them?" she asked, glancing toward the front of the house, where the empty street lay beyond the curtains. I didn't answer right away. The knife slid easily through the potato, the peel curling away in thin ribbons. "About a lot of things." She didn't press, just kept working beside me, the steady scrape of her peeler a comfort. After she left that day, I stood at the window watching the sun sink behind the harbor. The sky flamed orange, then softened to a muted rose. I thought of the years when Henry and I would sit on the porch to watch it together, mugs of coffee warming our hands. Back then, the house had been full. Of voices, of footsteps, of plans. Now, some evenings passed without a single word spoken aloud. I tried calling Mark one night just to hear his voice. It went to voicemail. The next day, he sent a short text. "Busy this week." "We'll call soon." He didn't. At the grocery store, I ran into Elaine by the dairy section. She smiled politely, asked if I needed anything, but her eyes flicked toward her cart already half full. She didn't linger. Walking home with my own small bag, I felt the weight of the street's emptiness. The houses on either side stood quiet, their windows reflecting the pale winter light. My breath came out in soft clouds. Back inside, I hung my coat by the door and sat at the kitchen table. The flyer from that morning still lay where I'd left it, the glossy photograph of a white building framed by palm trees staring up at me. I turned it over without looking too closely. The truth settled like the frost outside. They weren't just waiting for me to agree to their plan. They were making sure I had fewer and fewer reasons to say no. A week later, Mark called in the late afternoon. The sky outside was already dimming, the harbor mist curling along the shoreline. "Mom," he said, "about Sunday. Elaine and I are going to have to cancel dinner. Something came up." I gripped the phone tighter. "Is everything all right?" "Yeah, just busy." "We'll do it another time." His tone was light but too quick to close the conversation. I told him to take care, then hung up. The tea in my cup had gone cold. On Sunday, I settled into the armchair with a book, telling myself it didn't matter. But when I reached for my reading glasses on the side table, my phone screen lit up with a photo notification from a neighbor. It was a shot from social media. Mark, Elaine, and several relatives gathered around a long table, wine glasses raised, smiles broad. The caption read, "Family night?" The room seemed to tilt for a moment. The hum of the refrigerator became a steady roar in my ears. They hadn't just canceled. They'd replaced me. I set the phone down carefully and stared at the wall. The framed photograph of Henry and me on our 25th anniversary hung there, his smile so open, so certain. Back then, family meant something solid. Now it felt like sand slipping through my fingers. The next day, Lily arrived with a basket of bread still warm from the oven. She noticed my silence immediately. "What happened?" she asked, setting the basket on the counter. I hesitated, then told her. She frowned. "That's low, Nora, real low." "They have their reasons," I said quietly, though the words tasted like ash. "No reason good enough to treat you like that," she replied. She reached across the table, covering my hand with hers. Her fingers were warm, grounding me. We ate slices of bread with butter, the kitchen filled with the smell of yeast and comfort. For a while, we talked about other things. Her classes, the seals she'd spotted on the rocks near the lighthouse. But the weight of Sunday stayed with me. That evening, after she left, I walked through the house switching off lights. Each room felt larger than it should, the shadows stretching long across the floor. In the hallway, the old clock ticked steadily, indifferent to the shifting lines of loyalty in this family. Before bed, I sat at the writing desk and pulled out a stack of letters Henry had written me over the years. His handwriting, firm and slanted, filled the pages. One line from a letter dated the year Mark was born caught my eye. "No matter what, this house will always be your place." So I closed my eyes, holding on to those words. They were an anchor in water that was growing colder by the day. From the front window, I could see the distant glow of the town. Somewhere in that light, my son and his wife were probably laughing, making plans. Plans that didn't include me. And deep down I knew the next time we were all in the same room, whatever civility was left might not survive. Elaine's invitation came on a Thursday afternoon. Her voice over the phone was bright, almost brittle. "We're having a small dinner on Saturday. You should come. Everyone will be there." Something in her tone made me pause. Still, I agreed. After weeks of being left out, part of me wanted to see them all in one room, if only to gauge where I stood. Saturday evening, the air carried the damp chill of the harbor. I wore my navy wool dress. The one Henry always said brought out my eyes. The ride to their house was quiet, the streets lined with bare trees swaying under the streetlights. When I arrived, laughter drifted through the front windows. Elaine opened the door with a practiced smile. "Nora, come in." A warm air scented with rosemary and roasting meat met me as I stepped inside. The living room buzzed with conversation. A dozen faces turned briefly toward me before resuming their chatter. Mark appeared from the kitchen, holding a glass of wine. "Glad you made it, Mom," he said, though his eyes slid past me toward someone across the room. I hung my coat and made my way to the dining table. Silverware gleamed under the chandelier, each place setting precise. The hum of conversation was punctuated by the clink of glasses and the low scrape of chairs on the hardwood floor. Dinner began smoothly enough. The roast was tender, the potatoes creamy. I listened more than I spoke, letting the flow of small talk wash over me. Then Elaine's voice rose, clear and deliberate. "You know, we've all been talking about how hard it must be for you to keep up with that old house." Several heads turned my way. My fork hovered above my plate. "I manage," I said lightly. She leaned forward, her bracelets chiming against the table. "Of course you do, but isn't it exhausting? All that cleaning, those repairs. Mark and I just worry you might, well, get overwhelmed." Across the table, someone murmured, "It's a lot for her age." A flush crept up my neck. I set my fork down carefully. "I've kept that house for decades. It's more than walls and a roof, it's home." Elaine smiled, tilting her head. "Home is where you're cared for. And honestly, Nora, we could make sure you have that. Imagine not having to lift a finger." A ripple of polite laughter moved around the table. The sound was light, but I felt its weight. My chest tightened. This wasn't concern, it was performance. Mark cleared his throat. "We just want what's best for you." I met his gaze. Best for me or best for you? The air shifted, fork stilled. Even the candle flames seemed to pause. Elaine recovered first. "No need to be defensive. We're family, family." The word rang hollow. My hands rested in my lap, fingers curling against the fabric of my dress. I could feel the room watching, weighing my reaction. I reached for my water glass, the cool condensation slick under my fingers. The rosemary in the air suddenly seemed too strong, its sharpness catching in my throat. From the far end of the table, a cousin I barely knew asked Elaine about her latest project. Conversation slowly resumed, but the warmth had drained from the room. I sat back, letting their voices blur into a low hum. My eyes found the dark window beyond the chandelier's glow. Somewhere out there the tide was coming in, steady and sure. And I realized, as I lifted my glass again, that this dinner wasn't about including me. It was about showing me my place. I didn't answer Elaine's last remark. Silence, I'd learned, could be sharper than any reply. I focused on cutting my meat into small, precise bites, letting the rhythm keep my hand steady. Around me, conversation picked up again, lighter now, but with a faint edge. Mark talked about a property his firm was managing. Elaine described a wonderful little place she'd toured with her parents. Bits of their words floated toward me, weaving into the same theme: homes, moving, selling, always circling back to the idea of me letting go. Halfway through dessert, I felt a light touch on my elbow. Lily, seated beside me, leaned in just enough that her hair brushed my shoulder. Her voice was barely a whisper. "They've been talking about the house when you're not around," she murmured. Mark mentioned something about getting papers signed before winter. I kept my face neutral, spooning a bite of apple tart, as if she'd just told me about the weather. "Who else knows?" I whispered back. "Elaine's parents, maybe more," she said. Her eyes flicked toward the far end of the table where Elaine was laughing with a neighbor, her bracelets catching the candlelight. "Be careful." I gave the smallest nod, the kind you could mistake for agreeing with a joke. Inside, a thread of heat uncoiled, so it wasn't just a casual suggestion. They were moving pieces, making plans. When coffee was served, I let the chatter flow past me. I watched how Elaine touched Mark's arm when she spoke, how Mark's glance toward me was quick, measuring. I caught the slight tightening of his mouth when Lily refilled my cup without being asked. The smell of roasted coffee beans filled the room, mingling with the buttery sweetness of the tart. I sipped slowly, each swallow buying me time to think. I couldn't confront them here, not with so many eyes, not when their guard was up, but I could watch, and I could remember. Later, as coats were fetched and goodbyes exchanged, Lily stayed close. On the porch, the night air was crisp, the harbor's salt tang riding on the wind. She pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. "Found this in the kitchen when I went for more water," she said softly. "Don't open it here." I slipped it into my purse without looking. "Thank you," I said, my voice low. Mark appeared in the doorway. "Drive safe, Mom." I met his gaze, holding it just long enough to see the flicker of something, impatience, annoyance, before he stepped back into the light. The walk to my car felt longer than it should. The gravel crunched under my shoes, each step echoing the steady beat of my heart. In the driver's seat, I started the engine and let it idle, the headlights catching the edge of the porch where they both now stood, framed in the warm glow. As I pulled away, their figures blurred into the darkness. The folded paper in my purse felt heavier than it should, like a key I hadn't yet found the lock for. At home, I hung my coat and set my purse on the kitchen counter. The house was cold, the quiet pressing in. I turned on the lamp, took out the paper, and unfolded it. It was a photocopy of a document, my name at the top, the property address beneath, and at the bottom, in a blank space marked signature, was a faint pencil outline where someone had traced the curve of a pen. I sat down hard. The kettle began to whistle, though I didn't remember putting it on. They weren't just circling. They were closing in. The paper lay on the table all night. I couldn't bring myself to put it away. Every time I passed through the kitchen, my eyes snagged on my name in bold, the faint pencil tracing at the bottom. It felt like a ghost hand reaching for what was mine. By morning, the tide in my chest had shifted from shock to a steady resolve. If Mark and Elaine were moving against me, I needed to know exactly how far they'd gone. I tucked the document into a plain folder and dressed in my warm coat. The air outside was sharp enough to sting my cheeks as I walked to the car. Frost clung to the edges of the windshield, glinting in the pale winter sun. Instead of heading into town for groceries as usual, I turned toward the county offices. The building was old brick, its brass door handles cold under my palm. Inside, the scent of paper and polish wrapped around me, a quiet place where every word and number lived on in black and white. The clerk at the records desk looked up from her computer. "Can I help you?" "Yes," I said, keeping my tone even. "I'd like to see any recent filings on my property." I slid the address across the counter on a scrap of paper. She typed quickly, her nails clicking against the keys. One moment. Her brow furrowed slightly and she clicked again. "Looks like there's been a title inquiry and a preliminary transfer document filed. Not finalized, but it's here in the system." My fingers tightened around the folder in my hands. "When?" She read off a date. "Just 3 weeks ago. Filed by a real estate law firm out of Portland." "Do you want a copy?" "Yes, please." My voice was steady, though my pulse was loud in my ears. She returned with a thin packet. The paper was crisp, the type clean and impersonal, and there in the section marked "Authorized Party" was Mark's name. Elaine's was listed as "Interested Party." I thanked her and stepped back into the cold. The wind coming off the harbor smelled of brine and engine fuel, the same mix that once meant home and work and safety. Now it carried a different weight. I sat in the car, the packet on my lap, and flipped to the last page. A notary block sat empty, waiting for a signature and a date. They hadn't gotten that far yet, but they intended to. The drive home felt longer than it should. Every landmark, the lighthouse, the row of weathered cottages, the diner with its neon "open" sign, passed in a blur. My thoughts kept circling back to the law firm's name. I knew that name. Henry had used them once, years ago when we updated our will. At the kitchen table, I spread out both sets of documents, the photocopy Lily had given me and the official filing from the county. The font matched. The property description was identical. Only the dates differed. I picked up the phone and dialed the number listed for the law firm, disguising my voice slightly. "Hi, I'm calling to check on the status of a property transfer for a family member," I said. "The address is..." The receptionist hesitated, then said, "You'll need to speak to Mr. Dalton. He's handling that file." A Dalton. That was the same attorney Henry had trusted, and if Dalton was involved now, it meant someone close had convinced him to act. I hung up without leaving my name. My reflection in the window was pale, my jaw set. The kettle began to hum on the stove, the sound low and steady, like a warning building in my ears. They weren't just planning. They had someone with history on their side. And if I wanted to stop them, I'd have to step back into that history myself. I didn't call ahead. If Dalton heard my name, he might prepare his answers, or worse, refuse to see me. Instead, I drove straight to Portland the next morning, the ocean a gray blur beside the highway. The wind rattled the car at each curve, but my grip on the wheel stayed steady. Dalton and Price Law offices sat in a converted Victorian house with polished brass plates by the door. Inside, the air was warm and faintly scented with lemon polish. A young receptionist looked up from her desk. "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said with a small smile, "but Mr. Dalton handled some paperwork for my late husband years ago. I'm in town and thought I'd see if he has a moment." She hesitated, then picked up the phone. A low exchange followed before she nodded. "Hey, can see you now." Dalton's office hadn't changed much since the last time I'd been here. Heavy oak desk, framed nautical charts on the wall, a row of leather-bound law books. He stood as I entered, his hair whiter than I remembered, but his handshake just as firm. "Nora?" he said warmly. "It's been a long time. How have you been? Managing?" I replied, settling into the chair across from him. "Actually, I came because I've been thinking about updating some of the documents Henry and I drew up. The will, the deed, things like that." He nodded. "It's wise to keep those current." I reached into my bag and pulled out an old folder, deliberately leaving the edge of the county document peeking out beneath it. "I just want to be sure everything is in order. I'd hate for any misunderstandings later." Dalton's eyes flicked to the paper. "Too quick to be casual." "Of course." I let a pause stretch between us, long enough for the wall clocks ticking to fill the room. "Out of curiosity," I said lightly, "if someone wanted to transfer property before an estate was settled, how would that work?" He leaned back slightly. "It would require the owner's consent, notarized and witnessed. And, ideally, a clear understanding between all parties involved. And if that consent was, let's say, encouraged by family members." He gave a small, non-committal shrug. "Family matters can be delicate?" I smiled, as if we were discussing the weather. "You know, Mark's been helping me more lately." "He means well, of course, but sometimes I think he forgets that I'm still perfectly capable of making my own decisions." Dalton's fingers tapped once against his desk blotter. "Your son is thorough," he said carefully. "When he approached me, he mentioned wanting to streamline things for you, avoid complications down the road by—" The words landed like a stone in my gut. "Approached you recently?" 3 weeks ago," he said, flipping open a file. I recognized my address on the top page. "We discussed preliminary steps, but I told him I'd need to meet with you directly before moving forward." I nodded slowly, masking the heat rising in my chest. "That was prudent of you?" He closed the file, meeting my eyes. "Nora, I've known you a long time. If you're not comfortable, say so." "Nothing's been signed." Yet. The single word rang in my ears. I stood, smoothing my coat. "Thank you, Dalton. I'll be in touch soon." Outside, the cold air hit my face like a wave. I walked to the car with measured steps, my breath clouding in the gray light. In my bag, the folder seemed heavier now, not just paper, but proof. Proof that Mark had already taken the first steps to push me out. As I started the engine, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes were steady, my jaw set. They thought they were steering this. It was time to turn the wheel. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the rhythm of the wind outside rattling the old window panes. Every creak of the house felt amplified, each sound a reminder of how long I'd kept it standing on my own. I turned onto my side and looked at the empty space beside me. Henry's pillow was gone, but in the faint moonlight, I could still picture him there. Broad shoulders, steady breathing, the smell of cedar and salt water clinging to his skin. His voice came back to me, clear as if he were leaning close. "Never sign anything you don't understand. And never, ever sign when someone's pushing you." I closed my eyes, letting those words anchor me. Mark and Elaine's plan was no longer speculation. It was a moving tide, and I was standing in its path. If I didn't act now, I'd be swept under. By morning, I knew the first step wasn't confrontation. It was preparation. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table with a notepad. The paper felt thin under my pen as I began writing dates, times, snippets of conversations. Every remark about the house, every helpful suggestion about my future, the canceled dinner, the social media photo, the dinner at their place, the public push to sell, Lily's warning, the document from the county, the meeting with Dalton. The kettle hissed softly on the stove, a low hum beneath my thoughts. I added names. Elaine's parents, the neighbors who'd heard hints about plans. I underlined Dalton's name twice. When the list was complete, I tucked it into a plain envelope and slipped it into the hollow space behind the kitchen clock. Henry had built that clock himself. No one but me knew the back opened. Next, I found the small black camera Lily had given me last Christmas. "So you can take pictures of the harbor seals," she'd said. I charged it fully, then placed it in my handbag. By midday, I was at the hardware store under the pretense of buying a new latch for the shed. In reality, I picked up a pair of small voice recorders, cheap, discreet, easy to hide. The clerk bagged them without a second glance. Back home, I moved through the rooms quietly, as if the walls could overhear. One recorder went in the living room near the sofa where guests always sat. The other in the kitchen, tucked behind the jar of tea bags. I tested them. Clear sound, every word crisp. The house felt different after that. Less like a stage where others could dictate the scene, more like a place where I was setting the script. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the briny scent of low tide. I opened the window, letting the salt air fill the room. That evening, as the sky turned a bruised purple, I stood by the back door watching the harbor lights flicker on. Somewhere out there, Mark and Elaine were likely making their next move. I smiled faintly. Let them, because I'd just made mine. The next morning, I brewed coffee and moved around the kitchen, as if nothing in my world had shifted. But the small recorder behind the tea jar was already running, its tiny red light hidden from view. I didn't have to wait long for my first chance. Elaine called just after 10. "Mark and I thought we'd swing by later this week," she said, her voice syrupy. "We can take a look at the porch steps. See what repairs you might need before the snow gets bad." "That's thoughtful," I replied, keeping my tone light. You know, I was thinking about whether I should bother fixing them at all. If someone wanted the place, they might prefer to do their own renovations. She chuckled. "Exactly. That's what I've been telling Mark. No point in you spending money you don't have to." I let the silence stretch, the recorder soaking up every word. When they arrived 2 days later, I was ready. The second recorder, hidden near the living room sofa, was switched on before they even knocked. We made small talk over coffee, the scent of cinnamon rolls warm in the air. Then, casually, I said, "The property tax bill came last week. I don't know how folks on fixed incomes manage." Mark leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "That's why selling would make so much sense, Mom. You could take the equity, move somewhere low maintenance, and have more money than you'd ever need." Elaine added, "And no stress about upkeep. Think about it, you could travel, or just relax without worrying about repairs." I tilted my head. "And what would happen to the house?" Mark hesitated, just long enough for the recorder to catch it. "Would keep it in the family, fix it up, make sure it doesn't just sit there. It was the smallest slip, but it was there." Wait, that didn't include me. Later, after they left, I played the recordings back. The voices were clear, every inflection captured. Elaine's coaxing tone, Mark's careful phrasing, the unguarded "we." I sat at the kitchen table with the recorder in my hand, the afternoon light slanting through the curtains. This wasn't enough to stop them yet, but it was the first real piece. A shard of truth that could cut if wielded correctly. Before dinner, I took the black camera from my bag and stepped outside. The harbor was calm, the gulls wheeling lazy arcs above. I snapped a photo of the house from the street, then another of the property markers at each corner. A visual record, in case anyone tried to adjust the boundaries later. When I came back inside, I labeled a new folder in my desk drawer Evidency. The 2 recordings went in first, the memory card from the camera tucked neatly beside them. The house felt warmer that night. Not because of the fire in the hearth, but because I was no longer sitting idle, waiting for the tide to rise over my head. Somewhere deep in my chest, the ache of betrayal was still there, but now it had something to share space with purpose. I closed the folder, the latch clicking softly. 1 piece down, many more to go. I started the next morning with a list. Not the kind you keep on the fridge for groceries, but one written in small, neat letters on a sheet I could burn if needed. At the top, I wrote Puis plein. The first step was the bank. My accounts were all in one place. A convenience Henry and I had chosen years ago. Now, that was a risk. I drove into town under the guise of running errands, the folder of evidence sitting in my bag like a quiet passenger. Inside the bank, the air smelled faintly of paper and ink. My breath made a small cloud in the cold as I stepped up to the counter. "I'd like to speak to someone about updating my account structure," I said. Within minutes, I was seated in a private office with a young advisor who introduced herself as Karen. "I want to move most of my funds into a new account," I told her, lowering my voice, one with no online access and no joint authorization. "I'll manage it in person." Karen glanced at the forms, then at me. "We can do that? Would you like to leave a small balance in the original account for routine expenses?" "Yes," I said, just enough to look normal. By the time I left, the bulk of my savings was sitting in a new, secure account under my sole control. I tucked the paperwork deep into my bag next to the recordings. The second step was the deed. I called an old friend, Margot, who ran a small insurance office. We hadn't spoken in months, but her voice was warm. "Nora, to what do I owe this pleasure?" "I need a recommendation," I said. "A good title company, quiet, discreet." "Not a problem," she replied. "I'll text you a name." By afternoon, I was in a tidy office on the edge of town, meeting with a title clerk who agreed to run a confirmation on my property ownership and flag any attempts to file changes without my signature. "Consider it an alert system," she said. "If anything comes through, you'll know before it's processed." The third step was more subtle. I called the utility companies and changed all account passwords, adding secondary security questions only I could answer. Mark had once helped by paying a bill over the phone. I wasn't going to leave that door open again. That evening, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, reviewing my list. 3 steps down, and they didn't know a thing. The wind outside rattled the porch steps they'd once suggested replacing, and I smiled faintly. Let them think I was sitting idle, waiting for their next visit. The phone rang just before dusk. Elaine's voice was bright. "Mark and I were thinking, maybe we could come by this weekend. Help you sort through some of the old papers in the attic." I pictured the boxes up there. Henry's letters, the deed to the house, photos from decades past. "That's kind," I said, "but I've actually started on it myself. I'll let you know if I need help." There was the smallest pause before she replied, "Of course. Just offering." After we hung up, I set the recorder in the living room to catch any drop-in visits. Then I went to the desk and pulled out the EVA-DNC folder, adding today's bank paperwork and the title company agreement. The folder was thicker now, heavier in my hands. As the last light faded, I opened the kitchen window. The scent of the harbor drifted in, cold, salty, steady. This house had been my anchor for decades, and I wasn't about to let anyone cut the rope. Step by quiet step, I was taking the helm back. The next move had to count. I wanted them to feel the shift but not see my hand. That Friday morning, I drove to the small credit union where Mark had once convinced me to co-sign a line of credit for emergencies. At the time, I hadn't realized the account also linked to a business venture he and Elaine were dabbling in. A short-term rental they'd bought with her parents. My name was on the security as a guarantor. The manager, a gray-haired man named Willis, remembered me. "Mrs. Whitfield, it's been a while. I need to revoke my guarantor status on this account," I said, sliding the paperwork across the desk. "Effective immediately?" He reviewed the file, nodding. "We'll notify the primary account holders. They may need to provide new collateral." "I understand," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. By the time I left, the connection between my finances and their rental property was severed. They'd get the notice in a few days, and when they did, they'd scramble. But they wouldn't be sure why. That afternoon, I invited Lily over under the pretense of baking. The smell of apple pie filled the kitchen as she rolled out dough, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Lily," I said gently, "can I ask you a favor?" "Anything, Grandma." "I might need you to remember certain things that happen here. Who visits, what they say. You've always had a good eye for details." She looked up, curiosity flickering. "Like for a project?" "Something like that," I said, smiling. "Just keep it between us for now." She nodded, and we moved on to slicing apples, but I could see the spark of seriousness in her eyes. She understood more than I said. When the pie was cooling, I asked if she'd mind staying over that night. "It'd be nice to have some company," I added. That evening, as we sat in the living room with tea, headlights swept across the front porch. Mark's car. The recorder was already running. He came in without knocking, his expression tight. "Mom, did you close the line of credit? We just got a call from the bank." I sipped my tea. I adjusted some things. "Nothing for you to worry about." Elaine, right behind him, tried to keep her voice light. "It's just unexpected. We had some plans." "I'm sure you'll figure it out," I said, setting my cup down. "You always do." Lily sat quietly in the corner, her sketchbook open, pretending to draw. But I knew she was listening to every word, her sharp young mind storing it away. Mark exhaled sharply like he wanted to argue, but Elaine touched his arm. "We should go," she said. "We'll talk later." When they left, the house was quiet again except for the ticking of the wall clock. Lily looked at me over her sketchbook. "That was about money, wasn't it?" I nodded. "And now we know how fast they'll show up when it's threatened?" I checked the recorder. Clear audio of the entire exchange. Into the evidence folder it went, along with a note in my neat script of I-9:14 p.m. confrontation about credit line closure. Witness Lily. As I slid the folder back into the desk, I felt the tide turning. Slowly, silently, I was pushing back. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of the harbor through the cracked window. It was the same air Henry and I had breathed on early mornings in the shop, steady, bracing, a reminder that storms pass but strong anchors hold. They thought they could take everything without resistance. They were about to learn otherwise. The harbor was still that morning, a sheet of pale silver under the rising sun. From my kitchen window it looked peaceful, unchanged. But in my chest there was a tautness, the kind that comes before you set a sail into strong wind. Today was the day. I sat at the table with my tea cooling beside me, the QIET plan list spread out in front of me. Every step until now had been groundwork. Today would be the cut. Clean final. Impossible to undo without my say. Henry used to say, "You don't have to raise your voice to take back what's yours. You just have to close the right doors." That was exactly what I intended to do. At 80:15, I called the county records office. "This is Nora Whitfield," I said evenly. "I'd like to place a permanent restriction on any property transfers for my address unless I appear in person with identification." The clerk, a woman with a crisp voice, confirmed my request. "It'll flag any attempt before it's filed. You'll get an alert immediately." That's what I want. One door closed. Next was the insurance agent. I had a policy on the house that years ago I'd let Mark handle the renewal for. An oversight I wouldn't repeat. Effective today, I told the agent, remove all third-party contacts. Only I can make changes. By 9:30 it was done. I set the phone down, staring at the steam curling from my tea. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, but it felt fortified. Like I'd added a lock no one else could find. The final call of the morning was to the bank holding my safe deposit box. The box contained our original deed, Henry's will, and a few personal items. "Remove any authorized users other than myself," I instructed. The teller hesitated, then confirmed there were two, Mark and Elaine, added years ago for convenience. My pulse kicked up. "They're to be removed immediately," I said, my voice steady. By 10:05, they were gone from the list. 3 doors closed before lunch. I took the folder from the desk, adding today's confirmations, each one labeled and dated in my careful handwriting. My evidence was no longer just about proving their intentions. It was also a record of every safeguard I'd rebuilt. Outside, a gull wheeled over the harbor, its cry sharp in the still air. I felt something like that cry in my chest, clear, cutting, purposeful. When the phone rang at 10:40, I didn't answer. The machine picked up, Mark's voice filling the kitchen. "Hey, Mom." Weird thing. Elaine couldn't access the insurance portal. "Did you change something? Call me." I smiled faintly, letting the message end without a reply. They didn't know it yet, but the tide had turned. Today was only the first pull. And I wasn't stopping. By late morning, I had the day's second list ready. Every lingering thread they could still pull if I left it loose. The first call was to my attorney, Mr. Yates. We hadn't spoken in over a year, but his voice was as steady as I remembered. "Nora, what can I do for you? I need to revoke all powers of attorney on file. Effective immediately." There was a short pause. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure," I said. He promised to draft the revocation and file it that afternoon. One more door shut. Next, I went through my address book, marking anyone who might hold sensitive information. Insurance brokers, investment advisors, even the small marina where Henry had once kept his skiff. One by one, I called them, confirming that any inquiries about me or my property had to be directed to me personally. No exceptions. Most were quick to agree, some with polite surprise. I kept my tone warm, casual, as if this were just a routine update. That was the key, keep the water still on the surface, even if the current below was ripping. Around noon, I took a walk to the post office. The cold air bit at my cheeks, the harbor scent mingling with wood smoke from nearby chimneys. Inside, I filed a change of mail access form, removing Mark's name from my P.O. box. The clerk didn't even look up as she stamped the papers. On the way back, I stopped at the hardware store for a new set of deadbolts. My hands didn't shake as I paid in cash, tucking the package into my bag. This house had weathered storms before. Today it would weather me. Back home, I made tea and sat at the desk, logging each change in the evidence folder. Dates, times, confirmation numbers. Henry would have appreciated the precision. By early afternoon, the air outside shifted, darker clouds rolling in over the water, the light flattening. I was checking the recorder batteries when the phone rang. Elaine's voice came sharp, a thin layer of sugar over something harder. "Hi, Nora. I tried to sign the investment renewal forms this morning, and they said I'm no longer authorized."
Do you know anything about that?
I let a beat pass, long enough for the tension to stretch.
Yes, I know,
I said calmly. I decided to handle those matters myself. Oh. The pitch of her voice rose just slightly. I just thought, well, Mark and I have always. I'm aware. I cut in gently, but things change. Silence on the line. I could almost hear her rearranging her face, her tone, her next move. Well, she said finally, I suppose we'll talk about it later. I'm sure we will. When I hung up, I slipped the recorder's memory card into the evidence folder. Elaine's voice, edged with unease, was as valuable as any document. The clouds outside pressed lower, the air heavy. It felt like the pause before a squall, still but charged. They were starting to feel the edges of the cutoff. And soon, they'd see the whole shape. By mid-afternoon, the tide was low, the harbor exposing its dark, glistening rocks. I'd saved the heaviest step for last, the one that would lock everything in place. I called Mr. Yates again. It's time, I told him. He didn't ask what I meant. We'd discussed it months ago. Within an hour, I was in his office, the smell of leather and paper thick in the air. On the desk sat a neat stack of documents, trust formation papers. The new trust would hold my house, savings, and any other significant asset. I would be the sole trustee, with no successor named yet. No one, not Mark, not Elaine, would have a claim or even access without my explicit written consent. Once you sign here and here, Mr. Yates said, tapping the pages, it's airtight. My pen didn't hesitate. The ink flowed, black and final. When it was done, he handed me the official binder. Heavy, solid. Keep this safe. It's the shield. A driving home. The weight of it sat in my lap like a secret no one could pry from me. By the time I reached the house, the clouds had opened into a cold drizzle, tapping against the windshield in steady rhythm. I set the binder in the back of my desk drawer, locking it with the small brass key Henry had once given me for important things. It fit perfectly. At 5:30, headlights flared across the drive. I wasn't expecting anyone. Through the curtain, I saw Mark and Elaine climbing out of the car, no umbrella, their expressions tight. They didn't knock, just walked in, shaking off rain. "Mom," Mark began. His voice clipped. "We just got a call from the county records office. Something about the house title being moved into a trust. They said they can't discuss details with us." Elaine's smile was brittle. "Is there something you'd like to tell us?" I let the pause stretch, the ticking clock filling the space.
Yes,
I said finally. I decided to ensure my affairs are managed exactly as I wish. It's all taken care of. Mark's jaw tightened. "Without even talking to us? This isn't your burden to carry." I replied evenly. "It never was." Elaine opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her gaze flicked toward the hallway, as if she might see proof of what I'd done. "Dinner's in the oven if you'd like to stay," I said, my tone light. "Otherwise, I'll see you when I see you." They stood there for a beat too long before turning back toward the door, rain catching in their hair. When the sound of the car faded, I went to the desk, pulled out the recorder, and played back the last 2 minutes. Their voices, shocked, rattled, were as sharp as the rain on the roof. Outside, the drizzle eased, the harbor darkening into evening. Inside, every door that mattered was closed. And tomorrow, the real reckoning would begin. The morning after the cutoff felt different. Not louder, not brighter, just lighter. I woke without the usual knot in my stomach, The one that came from wondering when the next knock would come or what they'd try to push on me next. The house was still except for the faint creak of the porch in the wind. I brewed my tea slowly, letting the steam curl around my face. The trust binder sat locked away, the desk drawer closed like a vault. Everything that mattered was now behind walls only I could open. By mid-morning, I noticed the absence, no calls, no unannounced visits. It was as if Mark and Elaine had pulled back to regroup. That suited me just fine. Still, I stayed alert. Doors locked, recorder batteries checked, a notepad by the phone to log any contact. Around noon, Lily showed up with her backpack slung over one shoulder. "Mom and Dad are taking my brothers to some game in Portland," she said, shrugging. "I thought I'd hang out here." Her voice was casual, but I caught the flicker in her eyes. Maybe she didn't want to be part of whatever tense air was in her own house right now. "Of course," I said. "I was just about to start lunch." We made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, the smell filling the kitchen with a warmth I hadn't felt in weeks. While we ate, Lily told me about a science project she was working on, measuring water salinity along different parts of the harbor. Her hands moved as she talked, her excitement spilling over. After lunch, we sorted through an old cedar chest in the living room. Inside were photo albums, Henry's pocket watch, and a quilt I'd stitched the year we married. Lily ran her fingers over the faded fabric, her expression soft. "You made this? Every stitch?" I said. Henry used to joke it was our first mortgage. We laughed, the sound easy between us. She didn't ask about Mark or Elaine, didn't mention the tension that had been simmering for months. It was enough just to be together. Later, as the light faded, a sudden gust rattled the back door. I went to check it, only to find the latch loose. Lily followed me, holding the flashlight while I tightened it. "Good thing you caught it," she said. "Wouldn't want anyone just walking in." Her words carried more weight than she probably realized. I smiled faintly. "Exactly." Afterward, we settled into the living room with mugs of cocoa. The harbor outside was a dark sweep, the only light coming from the buoy lamps blinking in the distance. Lily leaned against the arm of the sofa, sketchbook in her lap. I watched her draw, the quiet broken only by the scratch of her pencil. It struck me then. This was the kind of peace I'd been fighting for. Not grand gestures, not courtroom drama. Just the freedom to choose who sat in my home, who shared my table, who knew the real parts of my life. As the clock struck 9, Lily glanced up. "Can I stay over?"
Mom said it's fine. I nodded.
"I'd like that." We locked up the house together, checking each window, each door. When we were done, the place felt sealed, not just from the cold, but from everything I'd cut away. The quiet didn't feel like absence anymore. It felt like safety. The next morning, the house was wrapped in a soft fog that made the harbor disappear into pale gray. Lily was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal and one of my old gardening books open in front of her. "Thought we could fix up the front garden today," she said between bites. "It looks like it's been sleeping too long." I smiled. "It has. So have I." After breakfast, we bundled into jackets and gloves, stepping out into the damp air. The garden beds along the front walk were choked with last year's weeds, the soil compacted from winter rain. Lily knelt down, her hair escaping from her hood, and started pulling at stubborn roots. I joined her, the earthy smell rising around us. We worked in companionable silence for a while, the sound of gulls overhead and the distant hum of a lobster boat breaking the quiet. Every so often she'd hold up a worm with mock horror, making me laugh. It felt good, hands busy, heart steady. By midday, the beds were clear, the soil turned. We planted early pansies in shades of violet and gold, their faces bright against the dark earth. "These will hold up in the cold," Lily said, patting the soil down. "Kind of like you." When we finished, we went inside, cheeks flushed from the chill. I put a pot of chicken stew on the stove, the scent of onions and rosemary filling the kitchen. Lily set the table, lining up the spoons with care. While the stew simmered, I noticed the blinking light on the answering machine. One new message. I pressed play, half expecting it to be a telemarketer. Instead, it was a clipped voice from the bank. "Ms. Whitfield, we received inquiries regarding your accounts from your son and his wife. We informed them we cannot provide details without your direct authorization. Please call if you have any concerns." I deleted the message without comment, but my mind registered the shift. They were probing, testing for weaknesses. The quiet wasn't surrender, it was reconnaissance. Lily didn't ask who it was. She just ladled stew into bowls and handed me one. "You'll like this," she said with a small grin. I added extra carrots. We ate by the window, watching the fog lift slowly off the harbor. It struck me how much of this fight was invisible, played out in phone calls, records, and quiet refusals. And yet here was something solid, a shared meal, a day spent building instead of defending. After lunch, we washed dishes side by side. "Grandma," Lily said softly, "if they get mad, you know I'm on your side, right?" I looked at her, at the seriousness in her young face, and felt the tightness in my chest ease. "I know," I said, "and that makes all the difference." By evening, the garden outside was just a shadow in the dusk, but I could see the pansies' colors holding against the fading light. Inside, the house felt warm, the air carrying the lingering scent of stew and rosemary. They might come again, harder next time. The message from the bank told me the quiet wouldn't last. But for now, the doors were locked, the trust was sealed, and Lily was here. The kind of peace worth protecting. The lake was nothing like the harbor. Instead of salt and gulls, the air here smelled of pine and damp earth, the water still enough to mirror the sky. I'd signed the lease on the small cottage a week ago, the first place I'd chosen entirely for myself in decades. It wasn't grand. 2 bedrooms, a narrow porch, and a dock that creaked when you walked on it. But the light in the mornings poured through the kitchen like a blessing, and at night, the stars were so bright they seemed almost close enough to touch. Most of my things were still in boxes, but I'd unpacked what mattered: Henry's watch, the quilt from our first year, the photo of the boys on the beach. They sat on the mantel like anchors in this new place. That morning, I stood at the stove stirring oatmeal, the windows open to let in the sharp, clean air. For the first time in months, I felt no need to glance over my shoulder, no weight pressing between my ribs. By mid-morning, the sound of tires on gravel broke the quiet. A familiar car pulled into the drive. Lily's little hatchback, its backseat piled with grocery bags. She bounded up the porch steps, grinning. "Brought supplies," she said, holding up a bag of bread, apples, and a jar of local honey. "Also, big news." We carried the bags into the kitchen. "What's the news?" I asked. She set the honey on the counter like it was part of the announcement. "I got accepted to the marine biology program at the university here. Full scholarship." I blinked, the spoon in my hand hovering over the pot. "Here, by the lake?" She nodded, her smile wide. "It's only a 30-minute drive. I thought maybe I could stay with you during the semester. Help out? Keep you company." The image bloomed in my mind. Mornings at this table, evenings on the porch, someone in the house who came not out of obligation but choice. "I'd like that," I said softly. "Very much." We spent the rest of the morning unpacking kitchen boxes, arranging mugs and plates, putting spices in the cabinet. Every so often, I'd catch Lily humming under her breath, the same way Henry used to when he worked on a project. It made the space feel lived in already. By afternoon, we were sitting on the dock with our feet dangling over the water, the lake stretching calm and endless before us. I didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like mine to shape, and I intended to fill it with people and moments that deserved to be here. The idea started over tea that evening. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the windows open to the quiet lap of water against the dock. Lily was sketching in her notebook, and I was flipping through a box of old books, Henry's favorites, mine, and a few that had belonged to my parents. "You know," Lily said, looking up from her page, "you have enough here to start a library." I laughed. "A small one?"
Small is fine.
She said. "People around here might love a place to read, to sit, maybe talk to someone." The thought settled in my chest, warm. A library wasn't just shelves of paper. It was a gathering place, a way to keep stories alive. And after everything, I wanted this house by the lake to be more than just my refuge. I wanted it to be a doorway. Within a week, we'd cleared the spare room and painted the walls a soft cream. I sanded an old oak table until it gleamed, and Lily made signs by hand. "Whitfield Lake Library, free to all." We put them up at the grocery store, the post office, and the little cafe in town. The first Saturday we opened, 3 neighbors came by, one with a basket of muffins, another with a stack of donated paperbacks. We made coffee, talked about books, and ended up sitting by the water until the sun went down. Word spread. Soon kids came after school to do homework, and older folks stopped by just to chat. It was quiet, but alive of a hum of connection I'd missed without realizing it. One evening after everyone had gone, Lily and I sat on the porch watching the fireflies rise from the grass. She leaned her head against my shoulder. "You turned this place into something special," she said. I thought about the months behind me. The whispered betrayals, the long silences, the steady work of cutting free. I think, I said slowly, I just gave myself permission to live how I choose. Out on the lake, the moon was rising, casting a silver path across the water. I felt no fear of who might come knocking, no need to guard every corner of my life. This was my home, my choice, my legacy. And to anyone listening, to anyone who's been made to feel small, unwanted, or invisible, you're not alone. Your story is still yours to write. Because in the end, it's not about the money or the house or even the trust. It's about knowing you have the right to decide who stands beside you and who doesn't. Life will always have people who see only what they can take, but there will also be those who show up with open hands, asking nothing but your company. Choose them, protect your peace, and remember, freedom at any age is worth the fight.